Well, hello there, and welcome to our online version or our online session regarding Charlotte Temple. It's themes and techniques. That's what we're going to cover today in this. We touched on a lot of these last time in class. This may end up being 2 videos. I'm not sure, okay? We'll see how far I can get. I don't want to go too fast, but then again, I want to make sure I respect our time. So we talked a little bit about some of the background, the main characters of Charlotte Temple, and certainly the historical context and everything. I wanted to touch on 3 basic themes that I'd like for us to focus on. Particularly, we're going to talk about some of them in the discussion that's online as well on Canvas. First would be marriage and how to navigate the social expectations of marriage. And so the novel has a lot to teach us about that. It can be very didactic, that is, moralistic. It can also be read as just kind of exploitation fiction if you want to read it that way. We talked about that in class as well. The second is the author uses the term prudence a lot, right? Prudence, wisdom, measured, temperate kind of behavior. And so that seems to be a common theme that runs throughout the text. And then as well, duty and the prescribed roles for young women, and that's kind of related to both of the other 2 previous themes. So we're going to touch on these one at a time. I'm going to have to use my text here to find my pages, so you'll have to bear with me a little bit. So we talked a little bit about marriage. We talked about dowries and things like this and the way people approached marriage. But what message is Rosen sending girls about marriage? How can this be seen as an advice book? Now, one of the things you have to understand in the 18th and 19th century, advice books were big. Okay. Advice about what? About marriage and family life and domestic life. And this is how a young woman, sometimes a young husband, would read and follow the advice of very wise people. And this is how you should, this is what you should do in a marriage. These are the things you shouldn't do in a marriage. Things like that. How to get along and, how to show your partner care and companionship and those kinds of things. Seems kind of corny, but we have advice books today. All kinds of pop psychology advice books all over the place. Now, what I want you to see is the dynamic here that's involved when it comes to this emphasis on marriage, particularly for the middle and upper middle classes. Remember, what we're talking about here is not lower class people, working class people, rural people. They may have had traditions and things, but we're not talking about that class. We're talking about the class of upper middle class or aristocratic sort of people. And what you have is this clash of dominant views. You have sort of a religious emphasis or religious considerations, economic considerations, obviously biological considerations because you want family and children and that kind of thing. And then the issue of, say, friendship, contentment, companionship that is all part of that. Hold on. My apologies. That was a political phone call, one of those pre-recorded things. Anyway, so I want to take a look at, we looked at Mr. Temple's father's attitude, right? We remember that where his attitude was, now look here, it's okay to marry Mrs. Weatherby, but you need, she's got money and you need to consider that, and then you can keep Lucy Temple or Lucy Eldridge as a mistress. Mr. Temple does the right thing, of course. But let's take a look at Montreville's father. Now Montreville has some advice from his father. By the way, parents come off terribly in this novel. Of course, it's written for adolescents, and you can imagine a 15-year-old girl saying to herself, yeah, parents are terrible. They're so mean. They're always telling you what to do. They don't know anything about love. So you get a little of that, right? It's a teen kind of novel. But look at what Mr. Montreville's father had to say about it. This is on page 40 of my text, and it says, the precipitancy with which young men frequently rush into matrimonial engagements and by their thoughtlessness draw many a deserving woman into scenes of poverty and distress, or something that Montreville's dad says, you shouldn't do that. Don't marry some girl you can't support. You don't have any money, so you're going to need to marry for money. So just like Temple's father, who told him to marry Mrs. Weatherby and keep Lucy as a mistress, Montreville's father is saying, look, money, right? Money is important. How are you going to take care of this girl, etc.? If indeed a woman whose fortune is sufficient to preserve you in that state of independence I would teach you to prize should generously bestow herself on a young soldier whose chief source of hope of future prosperity depended on his success in the field, every barrier was removed, and I should rejoice in a union that would promise you so much felicity. In other words, listen, if you got some rich chick that wants to marry you, you really should take that deal. Watch this. But, mark me, boy, if, on the contrary, you rush into a precipitate union with a girl of little or no fortune, Take the poor creature from a comfortable home and kind friends and plunge her into all the evils a narrow income and increasing family can inflict, right? Not much money and a growing family, lots of kids and no money. I will leave you to enjoy the blessed fruits of your rashness. That means I'll cut you off. You're not going to get anything from me. For by all that is sacred, neither my interest or fortune shall ever be exerted in your favor. I am serious, end quote, right? In other words, you better marry for money. You're going to get nothing from me. So that's even more hostile there. The problem with all of this, of course, is that the economic interest of maintaining social status and economic status in the upper middle class is so pressing that it sets aside, I think Rosen is telling us, religious considerations. It sets aside the need to find companionship and somebody who's a suitable mate. And it's all about a sort of a cash transaction, which is really awful. It really kind of presents young women as being kind of like prostitutes in a way, that their parents are pimping them out in a way. And young men are almost forced into this because their parents too say to them, well, it's all about marrying for money. So there's a legitimate grief here. There's a legitimate gripe here, and Drosen's trying to address this. And I think probably she's in the right about this. That there maybe is too much emphasis on the transactional nature of it, the economic aspect of it, instead of placing more emphasis on compatibility and those kinds of things. Now, once again, I'm going to engage in great generalization here, tremendous generalization. However, do not confuse the values of our era from the values of a previous era. It's very easy for us to say, well, Rosen's completely right about this, because we tend to view the purpose of marriage as being love, romantic attachment, and that, we'll thrive together and we'll make it on our own. We'll pull ourselves up and make something of ourselves eventually, because that has been the largely post World War II American reality. But prior to the latter 20th century, economic considerations were extremely important. You were going to bring children into the world. Remember, there was no no reliable birth control prior to the early 60s. And people could end up having 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 children. How do you feed them all, right? It was very frequently considered important for a young man to have not just a job, but enough money to even buy a home before starting a family. Now, that would be unrealistic today, but it's something that is a major consideration. The other thing, though, is that marriage served as a kind of a safe harbor for women. Okay, and I want you to look at page 66. I'll find it for you and read it from you as well. This is a passage in which we get to contrast the status of a married woman to that of an unmarried woman who happens to be somebody's mistress. It's not nice. Okay. And this is an address from the narrator to the reader, and says, look, I want you to think about this, because here's the knife's edge that she has to balance. So she's writing it for teenagers, yes. She might be writing it for some moms and dads, but she's writing it and she's trying to show a character who makes a bad decision, okay? But she can't let the reader lose all of her sympathy for the character. And if she just has Charlotte go run off and, just start, living a wild life and, snorting cocaine and, becoming a stripper and whatever, then, the rather modest teenagers who are reading this will just be taken aback and go, oh my gosh, what a horrible woman this is. So she's got to avoid that. And instead she's got to say, look, I know that the moralistic family that you grew up with and the moralistic values that you grew up with make you want to say, ooh, what a naughty person she is, what a terrible woman she is, what a loose, fast, and dissolute woman she is. And she can't have them do that because she wants them to connect with Charlotte on a certain level. Because after a while, if you behave that way, or if you view things that way, you forget to, or you fail to care for her. And she wants the reader to care for Charlotte. So it's very easy for someone to be able to pick up the book and say, oh, well, I would never do that. Oh, she ran off and she became a tramp. Oh, my goodness, she's just a harlot, etc. She doesn't want to lose the reader. She doesn't want to lose the reader's attachment to the character. So she has to periodically interject, and we'll talk about this in a moment with the narrator, she has to periodically interject and say, now look, consider what it's like to be her for a moment. Consider what it's like there. She says, the wife whose breast glows with affection to her husband, and who in return meets only indifference, can but faintly conceive her anguish. Dreadfully painful is the situation of such a woman, but she has many comforts. So, in other words, if you're married to a man and he doesn't love you, and he doesn't pay any attention to you, and he never, he's clearly grown cold, etc., she says that's a sad and unfortunate situation. However, even a woman in that situation who's in a bad marriage at least has this one thing, and that is, dreadfully painful is it, but she has many comforts of which our poor Charlotte, who's just a mistress, has been deprived. The duteous, faithful wife, though treated with indifference, has one solid pleasure within her bosom which she can reflect, and she can reflect on, that she has not deserved neglect. You're not at fault. That's the one good thing. That if you're legitimately married to somebody and he ends up being a jerk and doesn't really, at least you have the respectability of marriage and you're not at fault. You're not the one at fault. Right? Because if you're a mistress, you don't have marriage, you don't have the protection of marriage, and everybody has the social stigma that's associated with that. That she has ever fulfilled the duties of her station with the strictest exactness, she may hope by constant assiduity and unremitted attention to recall her wanderer and be doubly happy in his returning affection, right? Maybe he'll change, right? She knows he cannot leave her to unite himself to another. Remember, divorce was virtually impossible. It wasn't impossible, but it was very, very difficult. Look, at least you're married. At least you're a respected married woman. Now, people behind your back may say, they don't have a good relationship. He treats her like dirt, etc. But at least you're a respectable married woman, and he can't do anything about it. He can run around on the town all he wants to. That's on him. But it's not on you, and you didn't do anything wrong. He cannot cast her out to poverty and contempt. She looks around her and sees the smile of friendly welcome or the tear of affectionate consolation on the face of every person whom she favors with her esteem, and from all these circumstances she gathers comfort. But the poor girl by thoughtless passion led astray, who in parting with her honor has forfeited the esteem of the very man to whom she has sacrificed everything. She has no reputation, she has no future, she has no security, she has no respect, nothing, right? So in other words, it's terrible, but it's almost as though Rosen is saying it is better to be in a bad marriage than to be in a happy mistress situation, because you give so much up and you pay such a heavy price that even if you say, well, I'd rather go live with someone out of wedlock, and even have children with him out of wedlock, if there's love there, than to be in a loveless marriage. And Rosen says, think twice, girlie. No, you wouldn't, because the stigma is so great. And so in other words, this is really a novel, and I'm inviting you to say she's trying to show them how to navigate for 15, 16, 17-year-old girls, right? Because they're going to have to be thinking about this. How to navigate the very rough seas of matrimony. What's it involve? What do you have to consider? What are the dangers? What are the temptations? What are, this is a big thing. And please remember, again, this is 200 plus years ago, 230 years ago. What's uppermost in the mind of a 16, 17-year-old girl is probably, I don't know, going to the prom or, playing sports or doing well in school and whatnot. She's not thinking so much about marriage. I mean, I don't know how many people at age 15 are thinking about marriage now, but at that time, this was the most important decision in a young woman's life. The big thing. Everything depends on who you marry. Everything. Your future, your children, your family, who takes care of your parents, whether or not you're going to have a decent standard of living, whether or not you're going to be able to have anything to eat, your social standing in the community. Everything depends on who you marry. And it's like high stakes, and you get one shot at it. One. And so Rosen's, in some ways, you can say Rosen is right to put a lot of pressure on these girls to think this thing through and don't do stupid stuff. Now, again, with the whole idea of trying to make sure that you're maintaining that string, that cord of compassion for the main character and not writing the main character, because she has Charlotte do stuff that a 15 or 16-year-old wouldn't do. Then that 15 or 16-year-old is going to say, nah, I don't hang out with people like that. She's not like me. I would never do something like that. She's got to convince the reader that this could happen to you too. Right? And so therefore there's more sympathy for the character. Oh gosh, she just made a mistake, and who couldn't have, I might have made a mistake like that. Oh my gosh, but for the grace of God, there go I. And it's supposed to scare them, like, oh gosh, what if I wrote a guy back when I shouldn't have? What if I decided to visit a guy when I shouldn't have? What if I did something with a guy when I was unchaperoned? I mean, I've thought of that. I'm glad I've never done it, right? So she's kind of scaring them in a way, but she's also trying to make that connection between Charlotte and the reader, and she does so in part when we see how Charlotte ends up going with Montraville to New York. She does not choose to go, right? She doesn't choose to go with him. She doesn't say, okay, I'll run off and live with you outside of wedlock and sure, whatever, I don't care. No, she can't do that, because then the reader would say, whoa, none of my friends would do that. I would never do a thing like that. Who is this Charlotte woman? And she doesn't have Montraville kidnap her. What happens? She's being persuaded by him, and suddenly she's overwhelmed with emotion and she faints. And then he scoops her up, puts her in the carriage, and off they go. Of course they have to, right? Because you can't have her be the bad girl who, goes off and says, oh, to heck with convention. I don't care about my parents. Screw them. I'm going to go have a good time in New York with Montraville because he's hot. You can't have that, because then the reader's like, I don't like this person. But what you can do is say, oh, look at what happened. She couldn't make up her mind. She put herself in a bad position. She should never have been there with him, and she shouldn't even, he kept riding her, and she kept saying, well, I guess it wouldn't hurt to ride him back. And then things progress, and then they get close, and then all of a sudden, you just never know when, your emotions could take over, and you could faint, and then find yourself on board a ship, going someplace, doing something you should never do, right? And so you can see these little 15 and 16-year-old girls thinking, oh, I hope that never happens to me. I could just lose control of myself, and then there I'd be. So she's trying to do that. So it's a little on the silly side. I understand that, right? But moving along here, we want to continue on with some of the other themes, which are related to, so for example, prudence, benevolence, and sentiment. And we talked a little bit about sentimentality and sentiment. Let me move my face up here so you can see me, because I am everything to look at, right? So sentiment and how it can be exploited. On page 98 of my text, which is getting closer to the end here, we see a very important passage where the narrator begins to address the reader. Again, this happens a lot. After a while, you get kind of tired of it, addressing the reader, addressing moms and dads, etc. But in chapter 28, A Trifling Retrospect, it begins with the narrator mocking the reader, right? Making fun of or criticizing the reader. It's quite an interesting thing here. Quote, "Bless my heart," cries my young volatile reader, "I shall never have patience to get through these volumes. There are so many ahs and ohs and so much fainting and tears and distress. I am sick to death of the subject. My dear, cheerful, innocent girl, for innocent I suppose you will be, or you would acutely feel the woes of Charlotte, did conscience say, thus might it have been with me, had not Providence interposed to snatch me away from destruction. Therefore, my lovely innocent girl, I must request your patience. I am writing a tale of truth. I mean to write it to the heart. But if perchance the heart is rendered impenetrable by unbounded prosperity, if you're some snotty little rich kid who doesn't care, who's a heart of stone, right? Or a continuance in vice, maybe you just think it's okay to behave that way, right? I expect not my tale to please. Nay, I even expect it to be thrown by with disgust. But softly, gentle, fair one, I pray you throw it not aside till you have perused the whole, right? And then it goes on and on and on. In other words, she actually stops, puts the brakes on the novel, and says, "Wait a minute, I may lose a few of these readers because they're getting tired of the sentiment, right? The sentimentality, the crying, the weeping, and all this kind of stuff. And so I'm going to reel some of them back in and say, now look, if you're not sympathetic with Charlotte, something's wrong with your heart." Right? You're not a very good person. Maybe you're just a snotty little rich kid who has no feeling for other people. Maybe you think it's okay to engage in these kinds of things. You're, oh, silly parents. You can do what you want. Have a little fun, right? That kind of thing, right? So the vast majority of readers would go, well, that's not me. No, I'm not a snotty rich kid with a heart of stone. I'm not somebody who thinks that this is okay. And so she's reeling that reader back in and saying, no, hang with me, right? Sentiment can be exploited. That's another thing that's important here. I am going to break this off and create a second video here in just a moment. But let me get through this. The benevolence as an important part of this, is the proper result of being moved by. So you're moved to an emotional connection with others, but that is supposed to prompt you to do good things for others. Let's look at 42 and 43 in my text. That's a very good passage as an example. Let's see. Oh, am I off the rails here? I thought it was. Let's see. I've lost my little spot here. Anyway, so for example, Mr. Temple, right, who saves Mr. Eldridge from debtor's prison. Okay, so it's not just enough to cry about something bad. You have to do something about it. You have to actually intervene and do something about it. But here's an important part also. Prudence has to govern our sentiments. Her attachment to Montraville is ultimately an imprudent act. She may have feelings for him. He may do nice things for her. She may want to return that with nice behavior, like writing pleasant notes and being polite. But at the end of the day, if the sentiments are there, if the benevolence is there, but if you're not behaving prudently, right? So there needs to be some head as well as some heart, some morality as well as some feeling, right? Now, you see that Montraville is fickle and he's very immature. On page 70 and 72, for example, he gets his head turned by this Julia Franklin girl, right? This dark-haired beauty that he's like, hey, it's nice to be with Charlotte, but hey, there's this new chick on the block that I'd kind of like to get to know, right? And so you see this Montraville glanced his eye at her gray nightgown and black ribbon, and his own feelings prevented a reply. Okay, that's about as racy as it gets. He notices her in a nightgown, okay? So what does that tell you about Montraville? Montraville is just following, like some young guy, following whatever hot-looking chick he can in some sexy outfit, and he's not thinking. He's not mature. He's not prudent. He follows his feelings. He sometimes does good things, right? So he's not like evil. He's not evil in that sense. He's just really imprudent. And he's immature and he's fickle. Look at page, so he says, her complexion was a clear brown, her eyes full, black and sparkling, darted with their intelligent glances through long silken lashes. Her hair was, and all of a sudden, I have been mistaken, said Montraville. I imagined I loved Charlotte, but I am now too late convinced my attachment on her was merely the impulse of the moment. I thought I loved Charlotte, but new hot chick. Isn't there a meme out there where the guy is with his girlfriend, he turns around, looks at the girl that walks past? He's too immature. He's too imprudent. He just acts on impulse and on sentiment, like, I feel for her. There's no question that he genuinely has feelings. They're just pretty shallow feelings, okay? She's just a cute girl. He likes cute girls. Nothing wrong with liking a cute girl. But he's acting in a way that's not prudent, okay? So there's a whole philosophy being offered here by Rosen. This is important because this is seen as kind of lightweight, kind of kiddie fiction or kind of junk fiction. It's not. It's not terribly well written, but there's some interesting thought here. A whole philosophy is being offered, and it's more sophisticated than you think. Sentiment begets, that is, brings about benevolence. Right? So sentiment, feeling, brings about good behavior. But both of those have to be balanced or tempered with prudence, which is wisdom, which is, balance. Okay? So you can say, well, I have all these strong feelings for this person, and I went out and did this for him or for her, and that's very nice. That's very nice. But is this a prudent thing to do? Are you rushing headlong into something because your feelings are taking over? Are you thinking things through? So you should hear what she says about how unfair and commoditized and capitalistic marriage is becoming, where people are almost auctioning their daughters off on the block. That's not right. But on the other hand, it's also not right, maybe, to simply ignore those practical concerns and say, well, now, wait a minute, you've got feelings for this boy, and that's fine, and he seems to be nice, and you seem to be like him, and each of you are kind to each other, that's fine. But let's talk about some practical things. Is this a prudent match? Is it prudent? Has he got a job? Have you got a future? Have you finished your education? What are you going to do? How are you going to raise your children? Those kinds of things, religious and philosophical and lifestyle questions. These are all the things that nobody, when they're young and in love, wants to hear. But Rosen's equally important. So don't just look at the parents and how mean the parents are about money, money, money. I don't think Rosen thinks that's unimportant. I think she thinks that there's too much emphasis on that with the parents, and there's too much emphasis on sentiment and such with the young people. We'll continue this in the second video, okay?